Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast where we interview experts to separate the science from the fiction in media coverage of psychology, neuroscience and health research. I'm your host, Dr Kari Leibowitz. I'm a youth development and mental health research fellow based at King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. Now, it is finally February, but it is still dark and cold. It's dark when I wake up in the morning and dark when I get home from work. And it's really hard to not feel miserable and lack motivation. And it's just so hard to get outside sometimes. So what if I told you that changing something as simple as our mindset about the winter could help with our well-being during the winter? Last year, I interviewed Dr Kari Leibowitz, health psychologist and author of How to Winter. So she spent many years researching how our mindsets can shape our health outcomes. So this is literally how our core beliefs about our health can affect our health in the long run. And she's applied this theory to the wintertime mindset. She went to lots of different countries and experienced different cultures and how they approach winter. And in her book, How to Winter, she pieces together the theory and evidence as to why a positive mindset might help us get through the winter months. So when I interviewed Kari, she clarified some misconceptions around seasonal affective disorder. She explained the current state of the evidence and how winter mindsets might be linked to well-being. And she also answered listener questions about how to feel better during the winter. In this episode and in her book, Kari is really transparent about what the evidence shows and what it doesn't, which is really nice to hear. Also, I learned that there are so many small ways that I can improve my mindset during winter. One of the worst things that I do is when it's like dark at 5 or 5:30 p.m, I will be like, oh, I can't believe it's dark and it's only 5:30 p.m. And she made the point that you can just think about that differently. So it's dark and it's only 5:30 p.m, but you've just like gained the whole evening because you thought it was 9 or 10 p.m. So learning lots of small things like that and her tips on how we can get through these last winter months before spring and maybe actually enjoy it. It was really nice to hear from Kari. So I hope you enjoy Kari's interview in this special Rewind episode. And I'd love to hear the ways that you've been enjoying winter. So you can DM us on Instagram or you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk to get in touch. And please don't forget to sign up to our newsletter on the website scienceorfiction.co.uk and get our latest episodes. But for now, here is the interview with Kari. So hi Kari, welcome to the podcast today.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
As I mentioned, you've just written your book, How to Winter, and it's out now. So tell us a bit about how you came to write this book. What led you there?
So after I finished my undergraduate degree in psychology, I was looking for some research experience and a new adventure. And I stumbled upon the work of a researcher named Yor Vitterso, who's a world-leading expert in human happiness. So he studies what it means to live a good life, a fulfilling life, a meaningful life. And he just so happens to be a researcher at the northernmost university in the world, the University of Tromsø, which is in northern Norway. It's over 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And so I wrote to him with the idea of collaborating on a research study. And as I learned more about Tromsø, I learned about the winters there, which are very dark and very extreme. They have 2 months of what's known as the polar night, which is the time from the end of November to the end of January, where the sun never rises above the horizon there. And long story short was I applied for some research funding to do a study on mental health and winter and try to understand the relationship between this long, dark winter and people's mental well-being in Tromsø. And then I moved there in 2014 and I ended up living there for a year and conducting the research that I'll be talking about a lot today about wintertime mindsets and well-being in Norway, and also living through the winter myself and experiencing what it was like to live in this really dark, long winter, to live someplace so far north, to live in such an extreme winter. And then after that, I went on to get my PhD in California at Stanford University. And, California is very warm and sunny and is not a great place to study winter. So I was like, oh, let me write like one, alongside the scientific article I'm working on, let me write one sort of popular media article about my research and my experience in Norway. And I wrote that in 2015. And the article gained a lot of traction. And like you mentioned at the beginning, people are really fixated on seasonal affective disorder and winter blues and winter depression. But spoiler alert, my research was sort of about thriving during winter. And there seemed to be a lot of demand for that. And so over the past 10 years, every year as the clocks change and the days get shorter and we get closer to winter, there seems to be more and more interest in this line of work of how can we embrace winter? How can we enjoy winter? People would reach out to me, journalists and media, for comment and for strategies. And so I really, in the end, felt like there was a demand for this book. My partner likes to say that I didn't choose this book, that it chose me. And that really it seemed like a place to combine my psychological expertise on the power of mindset and apply it to something that a lot of people around the world seem to struggle with, which is how to feel good in winter.
Yeah, that's so exciting. And it is really like, it's such a good point of like every time like the autumn begins, like the clocks go back, there's all of these like, I don't know, visual, experiential cues that happen every single year. So it's like a conversation that we're always having. And it's kind of not surprising that we have these like ideas around it, because we talk so much about it and it really like affects all of us.
Yeah. And I think, it's really interesting to be on a podcast that is really examining like science versus media, because I think the media really has in the past perpetuated this narrative that winter is inherently depressing. And there's all these articles warning people about seasonal affective disorder and winter depression and telling you how to prepare for winter. And it really, I think, both reflects, but also in some ways shapes and creates this cultural narrative around winter of like, watch out, you better brace yourself, be careful. And I think it is something that's on our minds when the clocks are going back, but the media coverage of it almost seems to be disproportional to, what's actually happening for most people in the world.
And not to go off on too much of a tangent, but it's even more extreme than that now with like influencers and social media. Because a few days ago I saw a reel on Instagram that was from someone that was claiming a sad lamp would fix the snooze button in your brain. And it had been seen by like 500,000, that had like 500,000 views, that video. So anyway, yeah, it's everywhere. We can't avoid it. But yeah, back to mindsets. So let's define like what a mindset is, what wintertime mindsets are, and briefly, I guess, what does the evidence show about wintertime mindsets before we get into an example of one of your research papers?
So I started my study of mindset and wintertime mindset in Norway, but I really deepened it during my PhD when I was part of the Stanford Mind and Body Lab, which is run by Professor Elia Crum. The way that Dr. Elia Crum defines mindsets is that they're core assumptions about things in the world and how they work. And so they're beliefs, but they're beliefs that tend to be broad, they tend to be very basic, and they tend to be deep-seated. So, some other mindsets that have been studied are mindsets about intelligence. This is a lot of work from Carol Dweck, right? Is our intelligence fixed, something that we can't change, or is it something that we can grow with effort and energy? Mindsets about stress have been studied by Dr. Crum and others. Is stress something that is helpful for our health and our performance and well-being, or harmful for our health and performance and well-being? So there are these sort of simplified beliefs about things that affect us very broadly. And so when we're talking about mindsets about winter, I think that the most basic way to summarize them is really this idea of, is winter limiting? Is it a dreadful time of year when you can't do a lot? Or is winter full of opportunity? Is it a time of year that is delightful to look forward to? And of course, one of the key features of mindsets is they are biased. We're always sort of seeing the world through our own biased lenses and our own assumptions about how things work and how they're going to affect us. Because the truth is that almost everything is nuanced, is paradoxical, right? There's parts of winter that are dreadful and limiting, and there are parts that are wonderful and full of opportunity. But the idea is that, where we sort of lie on this spectrum between one end and the other is going to influence us in meaningful ways whenever we encounter this thing that we have this mindset about. So in the case of winter, it might influence what we notice in the winter time, which might influence how we feel. It might influence what we're motivated to do in the winter, which is going to influence our health and our emotions and our well-being. And so these mindsets have consequences for us.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for explaining that. So, and then you also mentioned, I think I've seen before, that there's an element of, it's like a belief that you have in mind, but it's also combined with like reality. So it's like what you see in front of you at the same time as what you have in mind. Like they overlap.
Yes, definitely. So our mindsets, they don't come from nowhere, right? They're shaped by the objective properties of things in the world. They're shaped by the culture we live in, our upbringing. They're shaped by what the people around us think. So our parents, our friends, the influencers we follow on social media, all of these things inform our mindsets. And it's interesting, though, because the sort of total effect of something on us, like winter, is a combination of the objective properties that we're experiencing and sort of our subjective interpretations or our mindsets of that. So I give wintertime mindset workshops where I teach people about wintertime mindset and how they can adopt more useful mindsets. I mean, you're getting basically a sample of that in this podcast today. But what I often do at the very beginning is I ask people to just either shout out, or if it's on Zoom, to fill in the chat, winter is blank. And sometimes people come up with things that are objective, right? Winter is cold. Winter is dark. Winter is wet. Those are objective properties of winter. But a lot of people say things like winter is depressing. Winter is gloomy. Winter is a drag. And those are not a reflection of the objective properties of winter. Those are, you take this leap from cold, dark, wet, and make all these negative assumptions, where cold, dark, and wet, as we'll talk about, and a big thing I'm trying to get people to see, can be an opportunity for coziness, or can be relaxing, or can be refreshing, or all of these other different things. And so this is something that Ali Crum in the Stanford Mind and Body Lab talks about a lot, is the intersection between objective properties of things and our mindsets about them. And mindsets can't overpower the objective world, right? You can't be like, I have the mindset that winter is warm and sunny all the time. That's not going to make winter warm and sunny. But the point is that we almost always are aware of how the objective qualities of something are affecting us. We're almost always aware of the fact that the cold affects us and we need to, prepare for the cold. We almost always underestimate the impact of our mindsets, and we are often unaware that our mindsets are even influencing our experience at all. And so as sort of a mindset researcher, my goal is not to have people ignore the, objective circumstances of the world, but to pay more attention to mindsets, which often go overlooked and which we often have more control over than these other objective things.
Yeah, so almost be more aware of and be able to reflect on like our mindsets about the objective. So, I mean, I've mentioned it in the intro, we've kind of talked about it already, but we can't really talk about winter and mental health without talking about seasonal affective disorder. Can you kind of explain how the concept of winter mindsets fits or maybe doesn't fit with what we know about SAD or seasonal affective disorder?
Seasonal affective disorder is really interesting. And this is actually how I got into the study of winter because, I think there's this huge cultural narrative, as we've mentioned, that SAD is really prevalent, that wintertime depression is a really common phenomenon. It was discovered in the US by a psychologist in the 1980s. And the way that they discovered this was they found that some people who were depressed during the winter responded to light therapy. And so they sort of concluded in a somewhat backwards way that it must be the lack of light causing the depression. And they also found, looking at the US, that within the US, as you go farther north, you get more rates of seasonal affective disorder, you get higher prevalence. And so people living in the northern US are more likely to have seasonal affective disorder than people living in the southern US. Then they went on to speculate that this must be true in the whole world, right? That as you get farther north or farther south and the winters get longer and darker, you must see higher rates of seasonal affective disorder. But the research actually finds that that's not the case. And this is one of the things that really inspired me to do this study in Tromsø, is that in Tromsø, Norway, which experiences 2 months of the polar night each winter, the rates of seasonal affective disorder are about comparable to Maryland in the United States, which is much farther south. And actually, there's not a lot of evidence that people in Norway have higher rates of seasonal affective disorder than people in the US, even though Norway is much farther north. Now there's been a lot of other research in Iceland, in the Netherlands, in other Scandinavian countries that also finds this as well, that actually it's not the case that winter is inherently depressing and that the darkness makes people depressed. So it sort of raises some interesting questions about seasonal affective disorder and what it means. Now, the way that it was originally measured was that it was measured with a scale that looked at how much people change their behavior between the seasons. So when they sleep the most, when they eat the most, when they socialize the most, when they exercise the most, and which seasons they felt the best and worst in. And it sort of declared that if you change your behavior a lot between seasons, then you have seasonal affective disorder. But modern psychologists don't really like this way of diagnosing seasonal affective disorder because, say you live somewhere like Tromsø, where there's a really extreme change between seasons, where you go from 2 months in the summer where the sun doesn't set to 2 months in the winter where the sun doesn't rise. Wouldn't it be normal to change your behavior according to those seasons? Even in London, I think there's 10 hours difference in the light between the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And so to say that we should have the same habits and energy and sleeping and eating despite those changes in external circumstances doesn't really make that much sense to me. So now what most psychologists use is a more clinically rigorous diagnosis, which is in the DSM-5, which is sort of the manual for diagnosing mental health disorders, where you first have to meet the threshold for clinical depression, and then seasonal affective disorder is a subtype of clinical depression. And I think this is really important because the sort of prevalence of the narrative of seasonal affective disorder makes a lot of people think that the threshold is lower than clinical depression. I talk to people all the time who say, oh yeah, I definitely have winter depression. I definitely have seasonal affective disorder. And most of the time, these are not people who would say, oh yeah, I have clinical depression. But actually, you have to have clinical depression to have seasonal affective disorder. And this sort of more modern updated diagnosis also takes into account this idea that it has to really impair your functioning and it has to cause you a lot of distress. So if you're sleeping way more in the winter and eating different foods and exercising differently and socializing differently, and that feels good to you, that's not a problem. It's really only a problem if you can't function, you can't take care of yourself, you can't meet your responsibilities. So there's been a big shift in thinking in how to diagnose and understand seasonal affective disorder that I don't think popular culture and the media have totally caught up with yet. Now, the relationship between wintertime mindset and seasonal affective disorder, I think, is really interesting. So no one has studied what I'm defining as wintertime mindset and seasonal affective disorder specifically. But there's some really interesting work by Dr. Kelly Rohan at the University of Vermont. So the most common treatment for seasonal affective disorder is this light therapy, where you sit in front of a light box, usually for 30 minutes each morning throughout the winter. And it shows that it's reasonably effective in treating seasonal affective disorder, and people get better. The problem with it is you think that it's going to be like sitting in the sun and feel really nice, and it doesn't really. It's like you're sitting in front of this harsh, bright fluorescent light. If you're doing it, you have to maybe get up 30 minutes earlier in the morning before taking your kids to school or going to school yourself or going to work. You have to carve that time out of your day. So it's actually a bit of a challenge to stick with it. And it doesn't work if people don't use it. So it's effective while people are doing it, but a lot of people, once they finish clinical trials and they don't have someone sort of nudging them to do it every day, a lot of people discontinue use of the light lamp. So Dr. Kelly Rohan at the University of Vermont wanted to take a different approach, and she also wanted to take what I would call a more psychologically wise approach, which is not treating seasonal affective disorder as just a problem of biology, not enough light, get more light, fix it, but as a problem of psychology. What do people think about winter? What are the scripts they fall into? What are their mindsets about winter? And so she's pioneered using cognitive behavioral therapy to treat seasonal affective disorder. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a popular treatment in psychology where you get patients to sort of question their negative thought patterns and their negative beliefs and to try to interrupt those thought cycles. And she does this with winter because people go into winter, they immediately have all of these cues, right, in the external environment of the shortening days, Halloween, the clock change. Now I'm going to feel depressed. Now I'm going to feel down. And she really gets people to try to look at things differently, to try to understand activities and things they can do in the winter that will feel good, that are mood boosting, that are natural antidepressants that they enjoy. You know, people join knitting circles, or they take art classes, or they go to yoga. And she has them sort of try to rewrite their scripts about winter, which to me is akin to what I would call a mindset intervention, where basically through cognitive behavioral therapy, what she's doing is changing people's mindsets about winter, the meaning of winter, and the impact it has on them. And what she finds is that while patients are in treatment, this CBT is equally effective to light therapy for treating seasonal affective disorder. But once treatment ends, 2 years later, the patients who got the CBT are much less likely to still have seasonal affective disorder than those using the light lamp, because it's changing the way people think about winter and the way they interact with winter, and that's having longer lasting effects. It's planting seeds that continue to grow even after treatment ends. And so it seems to have some benefits as compared with the traditional light therapy. And so for me, that's some sort of adjacent evidence, right? That changing people's mindsets about winter could be effective in treating wintertime depression.
That's really helpful. So I guess it makes sense. It's kind of trying to move away a little bit from, I guess, like a medical model of treating depression or mental health, and trying to change the way that we think as well. So multiple components. I've got like an image of one of those memes where someone's like sticking a plaster over like a hole in a dam. That's maybe like what using like a bright light does, but it like, you might like cement the hole in the, I don't know how you fix a hole in a dam, but you might cement it if you're changing the way you think at the same time.
Right. And I also think, I have some concerns. Part of the reason I went into the history is like I have some concerns with the original conception of seasonal affective disorder and how it was measured and defined. And actually, when you look at studies that use the more rigorous DSM criteria, you find much lower rates of seasonal affective disorder. So I think it's actually a lot less common than it's been portrayed in the past. And I think all these narratives, I think, just perpetuate these unhelpful mindsets about winter that watch out, you're going to be at risk for SAD. And there's so many other mental disorders like eating disorders, I would say, that are more prevalent than seasonal affective disorder that don't get you're not bombarded annually with warnings about how to look out for the signs and how to prevent them and all of these things. There's something about the annual seasonal nature of it, and I think the historical legacy of it that makes it in some ways overrepresented in our cultural imaginations. And I think it's perpetuating these unhelpful mindsets about winter.
And you do see that as well, like as you mentioned, everybody talks about it, and then that negativity also kind of spreads, like especially in the UK. I feel like something that we kind of have in common is talking about how bad the weather is, and that's so much worse. It's so much worse like in the winter. So just while we're on the topic of research, I want to focus on one of your papers. So in each episode, we dive into the research behind the headlines. And this week, we're going to be discussing your article, Winter is Coming, Wintertime Mindset and Wellbeing in Norway. And this was published in 2020 in the International Journal of Wellbeing. So here you studied the relationship between subjective well-being and wintertime mindsets depending on location, so in different areas of Norway. And the results showed that there was an indirect relationship between subjective well-being and mindsets and location. So can you just tell us kind of what this means? Like, what does the indirect effect show in this context?
Right. So the indirect effect was looking specifically at the relationship between location and well-being. So we looked at 3 latitudes in Norway. So we looked at southern Norway, in Oslo, we looked at northern Norway where I was living in Tromsø, and we looked at Svalbard, which is an Arctic island halfway between northern Norway and the North Pole. And these are 3 really interesting locations because Norway is actually extremely tall and skinny. It often gets squished at the top of the map or the globe, but the distance from Oslo to Tromsø is roughly equivalent as the distance from Miami to New York in the United States, so it's quite far. But Tromsø is on the Gulf Stream, and so the average winter temperatures are a little bit warmer than what you would expect. They tend to range in sort of the -5, -10 degrees Celsius, which is it's properly cold, but it's not as cold as you would think maybe for somewhere 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And so when you compare southern Norway and northern Norway, one of the main differences you're comparing is light. Tromsø gets a lot less winter light than Oslo. Svalbard, on the other hand, is more extreme both in terms of light and in terms of temperature. It's much colder, it's much more Arctic, it's much darker than either of these locations. So first, what we found is that as you went farther north, people tended to have a more positive wintertime mindset. So the people living in the most extreme winter in Svalbard had the most positive wintertime mindset. That's most likely because it's probably a self-selecting group. Svalbard is a really remote place, and most people are not born and raised there. And so you probably wouldn't move there if you didn't like the winter. But even if you compare Tromsø versus Oslo, which are relatively similar except in terms of daylight, there's a marginal, it's not significant, but there's a sort of a trending effect where we see that people in Tromsø tend to have a slightly more positive wintertime mindset than people in Oslo. We also found a relationship between wintertime mindset and well-being. So people who had more positive wintertime mindsets in all 3 locations tended to have greater well-being, they had greater life satisfaction, and they experienced more positive emotions. Now, the indirect relationship that we found was that the farther north people lived indirectly influenced their well-being through their wintertime mindset. So if you look, there's no relationship directly with location and well-being. So people who are living farther north are not inherently happier than people living in the south. But if you take their wintertime mindset into account, then people who are living farther north, who have a more positive wintertime mindset, have higher well-being than people who live in the south. And so to me, this is kind of about this idea that, like, if you live in a more wintry place and you have a more positive wintertime mindset, then that wintertime mindset matters even more for your well-being, and the impacts of it are sort of even stronger, where we see that, you know, mindset is helping these people who live farther north experience more life satisfaction, more positive emotions, and fewer negative emotions.
Interesting. That's really cool. Thank you for explaining. I guess just because we'd like to kind of talk about the methods a little bit, what would you want to do to confirm these results, or what came next in this research? Because this was one time point, for example, and when we're looking at indirect effects, we would want to test that in a longitudinal sample, so we can tell, for example, which way round it goes. So it could be higher subjective well-being leads to better wintertime mindsets, or it could be better wintertime mindsets leads to higher subjective well-being, or it could be both ways. So I'm just interested to know where this led to. What comes next in the research?
You're exactly right. This was a correlational study that I did during sort of like a research year abroad. And so there's lots of limitations of what you can do. So if I were to continue this research, there's a lot of things I would want to do to really understand how far these findings go, right? So one would be sort of a more longitudinal study. This was cross-sectional. We just surveyed people at one time point. So I'd like to see over time, over multiple seasons, over multiple winters, what's the relationship like between wintertime mindset and well-being? But what I'd really like to do is what we call an intervention study, where you try to change someone's mindset and then see if benefits to well-being follow as a result. And this would be an experimental study, a randomized control trial. It would allow us to draw many more helpful conclusions, I think, about which direction these relationships go. So I have a vision of, like, you know, finding a northern university, maybe in the US or somewhere else, that attracts a lot of people who haven't lived in a wintry place before, or attracts a lot of international students, and randomizing them and giving half of them sort of a, you know, general well-being seminar, and giving half of them a wintertime mindset seminar, where they learn a lot of the strategies that I suggest for improving your wintertime mindset, for cultivating a more adaptive wintertime mindset, and then follow them over the next winter and see, did the students who got the wintertime mindset intervention, do they have greater well-being? Are they behaving differently? Are they more likely to exercise in the winter, or be social in the winter, or go outside and face winter weather? Those kinds of things. So that kind of experimental interventional study, I think, could be really exciting. And we know from, you know, my other research and other research by people who study mindset, that when you intervene on these mindsets, benefits to health and well-being often follow. So when you can pinpoint these mindsets that are really useful, and use some of these evidence-based strategies for helping people cultivate more useful mindsets, it tends to improve physical, emotional, and social well-being. And we've seen that in a number of other domains beyond winter, but it hasn't been tested directly in winter yet, unless you count some of the research being done with cognitive behavioral therapy and seasonal affective disorder, which is a kind of wintertime mindset intervention, I would say,
Yeah.
But perhaps a different one. So anybody wants to collaborate on this study with me, please reach out. You can find me at KariLeibowitz.com. But no, I think this would be a really fun study to do. And the whole book that I wrote is basically designed as a mindset intervention to help people change their mindsets about winter. And so I have a lot of anecdotal reports that it makes a difference for people, but I'd really love to see a study on it and to find time to do that.
I think this study that you've published, although it's correlational, one time point that we've talked about, it's still a really important challenge to this narrative that we've been talking about, and like a change in perspective, because there are a lot of misconceptions about, you know, people's mental health that live in really far north or experience like polar night in the winter and things like that. So this is a really important starting point. And like you said, the book might help, might be a bit of a natural experiment. The way that you talk about research in your book is very balanced. And it's clear that, and the way that you've talked about it today, drawing on research from different areas, like, for example, the trials with seasonal affective disorder, it's very clear on what the evidence shows and what it doesn't, whether it's a correlation study, whether the findings have been replicated. So just interested to know why it was important to you to write in this way.
Yeah, so I think as a scientist who is now devoting a lot of time to sort of science communication and psychology communication, I think one of the things that we can do and have a responsibility to do is to be more balanced in the way that we talk about things and to shed more light on the scientific process. Because I think, you know, there's growing confusion and perhaps mistrust in science, especially in a lot of health sciences. There's a lot with the rise of social media and the internet. There's a lot of bad information out there and garbage evidence out there. And I think some of that comes from not being forthright with the evidence up front, right? That you hear one study says that coffee is really good for you, and then the next study says that coffee is really bad for you. And so you're like, well, I must not be able to believe any science because it's so contradictory, like it must all be garbage, you know? And I think scientists understand that not all evidence is rated equally, right? I would say my study in Norway was a really great starting point. It was a really great culturally informed way to look at winter a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, it was a, you know, one-time correlational cross-sectional study with less than 300 participants. Like, I wouldn't say it's the strongest evidence in the world, and I want to be upfront about that. But I think also as scientists, we try to look at things holistically and piece together different areas of research to form a narrative. And that was something for me that's really fun about science communication, is you can make some of these logical connections. You can say, okay, this CBT treatment for seasonal affective disorder doesn't use the word mindset. It doesn't say it's a mindset intervention. But if you really look under the hood at what is there and what's in a mindset intervention, you can actually see that these things are quite similar. And so it's very reasonable to use these things as evidence for each other. And so I think having that understanding helps you both be upfront and realistic about the limitations and also piece together different parts of the puzzle to see things as a whole. And that's one of the things I really like doing as a science communicator. And there's many amazing science journalists out there who do a really great job, really dig into the evidence, really understand what they're writing about. But there's also a lot of things that get transmorphed like a game of telephone from one headline and article to another. You know, I see people writing about my work and getting it wrong all the time, you know? And so I think as scientists, those who have the interest and the capacity to be part of the conversation, to share and talk about these things in a nuanced way, I hope will strengthen general scientific understanding and will help inspire more trust and respect in science and the scientific process. mean, that was also part of why I really wanted to be on this podcast, because I think it's like I so rarely get to really talk about what people get right and what people get wrong when they're talking about my line of research.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I completely agree because this is the purpose of the podcast. But no, I do agree that it really is our responsibility, like you said, about the different areas of science, like bringing together findings from different studies and kind of consolidating that into an explanation or into a theory about, you know, why certain things might occur or why we might feel certain ways. That is really important. And then also, yeah, exactly why we have conversations like this, because in today's like media landscape, we don't really get the opportunity to dive into the methods and to understand or to hear about the different components of the analysis and like what can we really take from that. We don't get these like long form explanations very often anymore. So yeah, that's exactly why we're here.
Like, and it's a balance, because sometimes the media is too short, but sometimes I feel like the scientific publishing is also too short, right? Like you have word limits and you have all these things you're trying to fit into a paper, and you can't give as much detail on the juicy methods or why you did things the way you did it or how you really felt about, you know, what had to happen in order to make the study happen. You know, there's not, you know, in that one little methods paragraph, so much is lost. And so I really like when these things go together, when we're looking at the scientific studies, but also the opportunity for me to write media articles, to write a book about this, was to share a lot of the stuff that didn't make it into that paper, of how these ideas came to be and how they were informed by me as a scientist moving to this place in the Arctic and having conversations with people and my own hypotheses changing over the course of that. None of that can come through in the scientific paper, and that's not the place for it, but it felt really good to have a different place where I could share some of that.
We had some listeners' questions, so I posted on Instagram that I was going to be interviewing you and had some listeners send in questions. And someone asked, so they said that they tend to view winter as a time to slow down and to hibernate, but find it hard when they have deadlines and when they have to carry on with like their difficult day-to-day jobs. So they asked, is it common to feel less energized and motivated when it comes to working in the winter months, and how might you address that?
Yes, I think it is. And I think, you know, part of this sort of phenomenon of people over self-diagnosing with seasonal affective disorder is because they feel that they're affected by winter. They feel less energetic and they feel like it is a time to slow down. And often our social structures don't allow for that, right? Our work isn't slowing down for us, or our childcare responsibilities aren't slowing down, our schedule isn't shifting. And so for me, I would suggest I would say that's very normal to feel that way. And I would say two things. One is sort of, how can you sort of find more rest outside of work so that you can give your energy to that when you actually really need to, right? So for me, sometimes just my capacity to do everything is a little bit lower in the winter. I need to rest more. I need more time to slow down. And so sometimes for me, that's giving up other things. Maybe I'm socializing a little bit less, still intentionally, but not as much, or I'm exercising differently, right? I'm going to slow yoga classes instead of doing, you know, my cardio bike rides, or my wind down time in the evening is a little bit earlier, and then I go to bed a little bit earlier so that I can sort of go during the day with the things I need to be productive about. The other things I would think about is, if you have any agency over how you schedule your work and what projects you take on at different times, you can think about what work actually might be well suited for the winter. So for me, actually, writing is very well suited for the winter. I have a really hard time writing when it's warm and sunny out, because like I want to be outside doing things. And I also find that challenging, even though I have more energy. Whereas winter is my time to sort of light some candles on my desk and make a cup of tea and turn the lights low and be more creative. And there's some research suggesting that darkness is good for creativity, that there's a study that shows that in darker rooms, people come up with more creative answers and more answers to problem solving questions. So this idea of sort of being in a dark space, it can actually help us focus because you're not noticing the laundry pile on the bed or thinking about the other things. And it also sort of, darkness is disinhibiting, right? That's why, you go to a bar or a club or a dance floor and the lights are low, it sort of loosens our usual constraints. So are there ways you could take on more creative projects or even more long-term projects at work in the wintertime to sort of match your seasonal rhythm to a deeper kind of work and getting into a flow state? You might not be able to do that so much on the mega scale, on the macro scale of what you're choosing to do, but maybe even you can structure your day like that, where you can pick the time of day that you're the most energetic and do that for the stuff that feels the most like ticky-tacky, like, whatever, answering emails or making presentations or whatever that is for you, and try to do some of the longer term problem solving, creative thinking stuff in the afternoons when it's getting darker and sort of make it cozy. And so I think you can work with that rhythm as well, potentially, and see if that helps you. But it's a great question. If you experiment with different things, let me know what you find and what works for you.
I think that that point about kind of, it sounds like you have to really sit down and think about what you can change for yourself or in your environment, because as you touched on a few times there, like if you can be more creative or if you can change the types of work that you're doing, because some people will be a lot more restricted. So like someone maybe doing like a 12-hour shift in a hospital in London who like goes to work in the dark and like leaves their work in the dark, like their approach to adapting in winter would have to be quite different to, say, me, for example, where like my day can be very flexible.
Yeah, I think depending on what type of work you do, you're going to feel this really differently. So thanks for bringing that up. That is, if you're working in a hospital or you are doing something that is less sort of computer based and more on your feet, I think it's about how can you find ways to give yourself energy throughout the winter. So if you have a break, can you go outside for 5 minutes during the brightest part of the day so that you can get a little bit of sunlight? Can you make sure that the lunches you're eating are really warming and nourishing and nutrient rich so that, if you're not getting your energy from sunlight, you're getting your energy from food? Can you make the break room at your workplace feel a little bit cozier so that you can have those moments of rest? Like you said, I think it's really about identifying the little areas where you have some control, because I think there's a huge spectrum of how much control people have over their work life and their work environments, and really trying to do a couple of small things in the areas that you feel like you can control and see how it feels and see, if and how that actually works for you. And that's really, honestly, that's sort of the whole thing of wintertime mindset anyway, right? Is this idea that we can't control the winter. We can't control the weather. We can't control what time the sun rises and sets. And so how can you work within those constraints to find more comfort or ease? And that practice is good training for all these other parts of life where our sphere of control might be more or less limited, and trying to focus where we can.
Yeah, I think that perspective shift is really powerful. There was something I saw in your book that I've like said to everyone that I've bumped into since about the whole thing of like when I'm guilty of this. I say it all the time when it's 5 p.m. and you're like, oh, it's only 5 p.m., but it feels like 10. And then you mentioned in your book, like, why do we never say like, oh, it's only 5 p.m., it's dark, but I've just gained 4 hours because I thought it was 9 p.m. Like, that is really like stuck in my head because I do that all the time. I'm like, oh no, it's only, it's so dark and it's only 5. But you can change the way that you see that.
Yeah, I think it being earlier than you thought is really a gift for me. I'm always running late for things. So it being earlier than I thought is like, oh yeah, what am I going to do with all this extra time?
Yeah. I've also been doing a little experiment. Little experiments since I started reading your book with like trying to notice things more, take photos of, the trees changing, whatever. And then one thing I've done is like slept in. I really resonate with this more sleep thing. I really enjoy sleep, especially in the winter. And I've been, getting up half an hour later or like on a weekday, and I just feel so much better. It's like guilt-free. I'm like, it's the winter, I need to rest, and I feel a lot better.
So great. And actually there's some evidence. There's one study that found people with sleep disorders slept a half hour more. I think I'd have to check. I think it was non-REM, which is the deepest kind of sleep, had half an hour more of that in the winter than in the summer. And that was people with sleep disorders. Like a bunch of those people had insomnia. So like,
wow.
People without sleep disorders, like there might need to be more sleep in the winter. And like, I think we really beat ourselves up for feeling more tired in the winter and feel like, what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I get up when I normally get up? But if you look at the natural world, every other living thing on earth, plant or animal, is changing its behavior in winter, is slowing down, is resting more. So if you have any agency to do that, whether that's going to bed earlier or getting up a little later or sleeping a little later on the weekends or taking an extra 10 minutes in your bath or shower or whatever, wherever you can find that like extra rest time in the winter, I think seeing that as natural and healthy and adaptive is really powerful.
So we have talked about strategies throughout, I guess, but I'm really interested to know like what are some of your favorite strategies for enjoying winter?
Yeah, so I mean, one of them is definitely slowing down and letting it be a season where you slow down, because I think that was something I really observed in Norway was people slowed down, but they didn't feel bad about it. They were like, this is a natural thing for this time of year. And I had always experienced that slowing down as like a problem, as something that was wrong with me. And now I see it as like a more seasonal living. So I think that is one of my favorite strategies. Another one that like sounds so basic, it's like almost cliche, but like really turning the lights low and lighting candles, I think is really important. It sounds really fluffy, but when you do it with the mindset and the intention that you're welcoming the darkness, that you're celebrating the darkness, that you're enjoying the darkness, it really transforms this experience, and it really makes a gray, gloomy, dark day an opportunity to eat your breakfast by candlelight before you get out the door, or to have an early dinner by candlelight. And it's just vibey. And like, it really is a practice, I think, in saying, okay, like the sun is setting at 4:30. All right, what is that an opportunity for? You can't have candlelit dinner in the summer when the sun is setting late, So I think that is really powerful. One that is not my favorite because I also find it challenging, but I think is the most transformative, is to bundle up and get outside for a little bit almost every day in all weather. This was another thing I really learned in Norway, was how to dress appropriately for the weather and layer up and really have waterproof layers. This is also something, I currently live in Amsterdam, and Dutch people bike all over, even in the rain. And so waterproof dressing is really important. And I think this one is really powerful. One, because we know that movement, connection with nature, and fresh air, those are all natural antidepressants. So if you're feeling down in the winter, getting bundled up and going outside, I think, is naturally going to be a mood booster. another reason I think it's so important is that to do anything outside of your house or your work requires you to brave the elements in some way. And the less you do it, the harder it is. And the more you do it, the easier it is. And I can't tell you how many times, like at the beginning of fall, the beginning of winter, it's raining and I just don't want to get on my bike to go somewhere. And I'm like, maybe I'll cancel, maybe I'll stay home, maybe I'll take an Uber. And then I bundle up and I do it and I bike, and it's almost never as bad out as it looked. I almost always feel better for having been outside. And then it tries to teach me repeatedly that I can do it, that I can get outside and I can do these things. And that really helps unlock a feeling of possibility in the winter. And so I think time outdoors in all weather, in the rain, in the cold, in the dark, is really transformative. And it's something also I think you have to just try it as an experiment with an open mind. And I think you'll be surprised at how pleasurable it is when you're sort of wearing the right clothing.
And all of these things sound doable, even in a small way. I think that's what I quite like about this, is that you don't have to do this like huge transformative thing that's going to like get in the way of your life. It's just like finding ways that you can incorporate what works for you in your day. Like you said, going outside for 5 minutes, like, or 10 minutes or whatever, or lighting candles. Like, they're such small things that when they add up, they could make a difference.
And I also think they should be positively reinforcing. Like, they're not always easy to motivate yourself to do, but once you do them, they should feel good. And you should feel like, oh, actually, that was nice. I kind of want to do that again. And if it doesn't feel that way for you, then try something different. You know, I think they're all meant to they're not punishments, you know, they're not like things that you have to do to be good, right? They're all things that I think if you try them with an open mind and you like them, it will become natural to do them more and more.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today and just explaining your research so clearly, walking us through the strategies. We've got like lots of things to take away. I really enjoyed talking about it.
Thank you. This was so great. This was a really fun conversation and a really nice change from a lot of the interviews I do that are like the same thing over and over again, and also getting to nerd out about the science a little bit and have a platform where I can do that is really fun. So thanks so much. And if listeners have questions, they can find me. My email address is on my website, KariLeibowitz.com. I also write a newsletter that you can sign up for there if you want even more writing. And so there's lots of ways to reach me and to get in touch.